Eleanor had spent most of her life mastering silence. After her husband's passing, the quietness of her home wasn't unfamiliar, but it had grown heavier, like the walls were learning how to breathe without him. She moved through her days with calm precision, the same breakfast, the same newspaper, the same view from her kitchen window. Routine was her only companion until her grandson, Liam, arrived. He offered to stay for a few months while searching for freelance writing work, and she accepted, grateful for the company, even if she didn't fully admit it to herself. Liam had his grandfather's sharp eyes, but none of his age's caution. He was lively, ambitious, and carried his charm without effort. When he entered a room, the air seemed to shift, and Eleanor felt it more than she would have liked. In the evenings, they would sit across from each other, talking about art, books, and the things Eleanor had long stopped thinking she'd ever discuss again. There was an ease to it, a comfort that slid into her bones like old music rediscovered. At first, Eleanor thought it was simple gratitude. She admired how Liam spoke of his dreams with no filter, his thoughts stretching far beyond the small town's borders. She found herself laughing more often, her cheeks aching from smiles she thought were left in the past. But slowly, something unspoken began settling between them. She noticed the way her heart lifted when he entered the room, the way her loneliness quieted when he spoke. His kindness felt sharper than it should, and her reflection in the mirror started to matter to her in a way it hadn't in years. She told herself it was nothing, just a foolish sense of nostalgia for her younger years, stirred by Liam's youthful energy. Still, her nights stretched longer, restless and full of thoughts she didn't have the courage to name. She would listen for his footsteps in the hall, catching the sound of his late-night pacing, knowing his writing was keeping him up. Sometimes she'd sit on the couch, pretending to read while waiting for him to return from his evening walks, her pulse unreasonably lifted by the sound of the front door opening. The house, once so still, had become alive again, and so had she, but it wasn't the innocent revival she had imagined. Liam shared stories of his short romances, flings that didn't last, and his disillusionment with modern relationships. Each confession left her feeling oddly protective and, at times, unreasonably envious of the faceless women he described. She listened too carefully, felt too deeply, but she kept her posture composed, her tone neutral, convincing herself there was no harm in being the one person who always listened. Eleanor knew it wasn't the conversations that pulled her in, it was the closeness, the warmth. She had spent so long without either that even the smallest dose felt overwhelming. What she didn't want to admit was that for the first time since her husband's death, the emptiness inside her didn't feel like grief, it felt like longing. Eleanor tried to convince herself that her feelings were harmless, a fleeting attachment born from loneliness, but the weight of them grew heavier each day. She found herself waiting for Liam's company, studying his voice, memorizing his habits, and feeling both comforted and unsettled by how easily he had filled the empty spaces her husband left behind. The quiet admiration had shifted, becoming something unspoken but undeniable. Every moment with him felt delicate, as if acknowledging it out loud would shatter whatever fragile connection had grown between them. One evening, while they sat sipping tea, Liam casually mentioned a woman he had met at a bookstore. Her name was Clara, a kindred spirit, someone who understood his passion for writing. His face lit up with excitement, the kind Eleanor hadn't seen before, and her stomach tightened. She forced a smile, nodding as he described Clara's charm, her wit, the effortless way they connected. Each word felt like a quiet betrayal, a reminder that whatever closeness she believed they shared had always been one-sided. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Eleanor stared at the ceiling, replaying his words, feeling both foolish and ashamed. She wasn't supposed to feel this way, not for him, not for anyone. She told herself it was the isolation, the years spent alone, the way grief reshaped a heart until it confused kindness for affection. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't about loneliness. It was about him. The way he had unknowingly awakened something she thought had long since died. The days that followed became a quiet struggle. She avoided lingering conversations, kept her distance, and returned to her routines, but the effort left her drained. Every casual mention of Clara felt like a quiet rejection, each word another reminder of where the lines were supposed to be. Liam, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her, continued to treat her with the same open affection, unaware of the effect his presence had on her heart. One rainy evening, the silence between them grew too heavy. Eleanor couldn't hold the weight any longer. Without meaning to, her words slipped out, not a confession of love, but of emptiness, of longing for meaning and connection in the aftermath of loss. She spoke about the ache of being forgotten, about watching the world move on without her, about the ache of being surrounded by people, yet feeling invisible. Liam listened, his expression soft but confused, unsure of the depth behind her carefully chosen words. The moment passed without resolution, leaving the air between them changed. Eleanor had not crossed any spoken boundary, but her heart had already done so long ago. She knew it, and the knowledge sat like a stone in her chest. Liam returned to his writing, and she returned to her solitude, but the comfort they once shared had been replaced with quiet, unspoken understanding. The line had been crossed, and though nothing had happened, everything between them was different now. Liam had always admired his grandmother's strength, her quiet wisdom, and the way she carried herself through grief, without complaint. But over time, the warmth between them had begun to feel different, heavier, harder to name. He noticed the way her eyes lingered when he spoke, the subtle shifts in her mood when he mentioned Clara, and the unspoken weight in her silences. He told himself it was just his imagination, but one afternoon while organizing some old boxes in the study, he found something that stripped away his doubt. A stack of unsent letters lay neatly tied with an old silk ribbon, each addressed only with a simple, "To you." Curiosity led him to read the first, expecting memories of his late grandfather or old friends. But the words were nothing like that. They spoke of longing, of desire, of deep emotional ache for someone present but untouchable. The language was tender, careful, written with a vulnerability he had never seen from her. As he read through them, it became painfully clear the letters were about him. The shock was immediate, followed by disbelief, then betrayal. The woman who had always been his anchor, his safe place, had harbored feelings that crossed boundaries even if they'd never been spoken aloud. The letters weren't explicit, but the intent was clear enough. He couldn't understand how the person he trusted most had allowed herself to drift so far from what was right, even if only in thought. When he finally confronted her, there were no accusations, only questions he struggled to ask. Eleanor didn't deny the truth. She sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly, and admitted she had let her heart wander too far. She spoke of the silence after her husband, of the loneliness that softened her judgment, and the comfort Liam had unknowingly given her. She swore there had never been an intention to act on her feelings, that they had lived only inside her, but even that felt like too much. The damage had already been done. Liam didn't know whether to feel angry or heartbroken. He understood grief and loneliness, but he couldn't understand how the woman who raised him, who taught him right from wrong, had allowed such feelings to take root. Their bond, once so unshakable, felt cracked beyond repair. He left the conversation without another word, packing his things that night, choosing distance over confusion. The house that had once felt like a refuge now felt like a place he could no longer call home. Eleanor didn't stop him. She stood by the doorway, watching as he walked away, and understood she had lost something far greater than his company. She had betrayed her own heart and, worse, the trust of someone she loved beyond herself. The silence that followed wasn't the peaceful kind she once knew, but the cold, permanent kind, the kind that filled the empty rooms and stayed long after the doors had closed. Time moved differently after Liam left. Days passed, but Eleanor barely noticed them, her world shrinking back into the silence she once thought she had mastered. The house felt colder, not because of the weather, but because his presence, which had once filled every corner, was gone. She avoided the room where the letters had been kept, the same way someone avoids a mirror after seeing a reflection they no longer recognize. The loneliness wasn't unfamiliar, but the shame that came with it was. For the first time, her solitude wasn't a circumstance, but a consequence. She spent her mornings writing, something she had never done before with any real purpose. Words offered her the clarity that conversations never could. What began as a way to pass time slowly turned into a memoir. She wrote about her life, about love that aged and changed shape, about the hunger for connection that sometimes disguised itself as affection, about the quiet dangers of unspoken emotions. The pages didn't hide the truth or soften the uncomfortable parts. She wrote it all, her flaws laid bare, not seeking forgiveness, but understanding. Months passed before the book quietly made its way into the local community through a small self-publisher. She had no expectation of recognition, and yet the honesty in her words resonated with people. The reviews were kind, some even grateful, from strangers who had felt the same ache of isolation but never knew how to name it. The book never mentioned Liam, not directly, but every page was a silent letter to him. She didn't write it for the world, but the world had read it anyway. One morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting was familiar, the name on the envelope even more so. Liam's words were simple but measured, free from anger, full of quiet reflection. He wrote about how long it had taken him to understand her pain, how betrayal didn't always come from bad intentions but from human weakness, and how love, even when misplaced, didn't have to be the end of everything. He didn't offer a reunion, only forgiveness, and that was more than she ever expected to deserve. She read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the book that had become her confession. The weight on her chest, the one she had carried for months, lightened but never fully disappeared. Some wounds didn't close perfectly, but the pain softened, allowing space for acceptance. She knew that their relationship would never return to what it once was, but knowing he had chosen understanding over resentment gave her a peace that had felt impossible before. Eleanor returned to her writing, not to escape, but to continue the work of making sense of her life. She had spent years pretending that loneliness was the same as strength, but now she knew better. Some stories didn't end the way people wanted them to, but even the wrong ones could teach the heart how to start again.